hammered against the corrugated iron roof of the military compound with the fury of 1,000 drums, each drop echoing through the dimly lit corridors where Captain Ibrahim Traoré paced like a caged leopard. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation unfolding in Burkina Faso's capital. It was 3 in the morning, and sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The phone in his hand buzzed with another encrypted message from his intelligence chief, Colonel Sawadogo. 3 more arrests made. The network runs deeper than we thought. Ibrahim's jaw tightened as he read the words, his weathered fingers gripping the device until his knuckles turned white. Each arrest brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to a revelation that would shatter something fundamental within him. He had been Tanzania's youngest captain when the revolution began, driven by an unwavering belief that his homeland deserved better than the corruption and foreign manipulation that had plagued it for decades. The French mining companies had grown fat on Burkinabe gold while children in the villages went hungry. The politicians in their air-conditioned offices spoke of progress while farmers struggled with droughts that seemed to worsen each year. Something had to change, and Ibrahim had been willing to risk everything to make it happen. But now, as he stood in the command center surrounded by maps marked with red pins indicating suspected coup plotters, he wondered if the price of revolution was higher than he had ever imagined. The arrests had begun 3 weeks ago when a routine intelligence sweep uncovered communications between certain military officers and external actors. What started as a small investigation had mushroomed into something that threatened to tear apart the very foundation of trust upon which his government was built. The door creaked open, and Major Ouedraogo entered, his uniform damp from the rain. "Captain, we have the full confession from Lieutenant Caboret. He's provided names, dates, everything." The Major's voice carried a weight that suggested the information was both valuable and devastating. Ibrahim nodded grimly. Lieutenant Caboret had been one of the officers arrested in the second wave, a man he had personally promoted based on his apparent loyalty and competence. The betrayal had stung, but it was nothing compared to what he feared was coming. "Any mention of Amadou?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Major Ouedraogo's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Ibrahim's heart sank even before the words left the Major's lips. "His name appears several times in the communications log. The evidence suggests he's been feeding information to the conspirators for months." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the relentless patter of rain against the windows.
Amadou Diallo. The name felt like a knife twisting in Ibrahim's chest.
They had grown up together in the same dusty neighborhood of Ouagadougou, 2 boys who had dreamed of changing the world while kicking a soccer ball made of plastic bags and string. Amadou had been there when Ibrahim's father died, holding him as he wept. Ibrahim had been Amadou's best man at his wedding, had held his firstborn son in his arms. When the revolution began, Amadou had been one of the first to join, his passion for justice seemingly as fierce as Ibrahim's own. They had planned operations together, shared the dangers and the victories. Amadou had saved Ibrahim's life during the October uprising, throwing himself between his friend and a sniper's bullet that would have ended everything before it truly began. The scar on Amadou's shoulder was a permanent reminder of that sacrifice. "Show me the evidence," Ibrahim said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Major Ouedraogo spread the documents across the metal table with the care of a surgeon handling delicate instruments. Phone records, encrypted messages, bank transfer receipts. Each piece of paper was another nail in the coffin of a friendship that had lasted 30 years. The pattern was clear and damning. Amadou had been providing detailed intelligence about security arrangements, troop movements, and strategic planning to a cell of conspirators with ties to foreign interests. The messages revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond what Ibrahim had initially suspected. French intelligence services, mining corporations, and disaffected military officers had formed an unholy alliance aimed at destabilizing his government and returning Burkina Faso to the days of compliant leadership that would serve foreign interests above national ones. The coup attempt wasn't just about power. It was about preventing the nationalization of the gold mines and the expulsion of foreign military bases that Ibrahim had been planning. But what made the betrayal so devastating wasn't just the political implications. Scattered throughout the intelligence reports were personal details that only someone with intimate access could have known. Amadou had reported on Ibrahim's health issues, his relationship with his wife, even the nightmares that had plagued him since the revolution began. Every private moment, every vulnerable confession shared between old friends, had been weaponized and transmitted to those who wanted him dead. "When do we bring him in?" Major Ouedraogo asked, his voice carefully neutral. Ibrahim stared at a photograph clipped to one of the files. Amadou laughing at their last dinner together just 2 weeks ago, his arm around Ibrahim's shoulders in a gesture of friendship that now felt like a mockery.
"Tomorrow night.
After the cabinet meeting. I want to handle this personally." The next 18 hours passed in a blur of meetings, briefings, and the mechanical routine of governance. Ibrahim signed documents and listened to reports about agricultural policies and infrastructure projects, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of a friendship that had apparently been a lie for longer than he cared to contemplate. When had Amadou's loyalty faltered? Was it gradual disillusionment, or had there been a specific moment when he decided that Ibrahim's vision for Burkina Faso was worth betraying? The cabinet meeting that evening was routine. Discussions about the national budget and responses to international pressure regarding the expulsion of French forces. Amadou sat 3 seats to Ibrahim's right, contributing to the discussions with the same thoughtful analysis he had always provided. Watching him, Ibrahim found himself searching for signs of deception, for some tell that would have revealed the truth earlier. But Amadou appeared as he always had, engaged, loyal, committed to the cause they had supposedly shared. When the meeting concluded, Ibrahim asked Amadou to remain behind. The other ministers filed out, their conversations echoing down the hallway until silence settled over the room like a shroud. The 2 men sat across from each other at the long mahogany table, the weight of unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. "Do you remember when we were 12 and you broke your mother's favorite vase?" Ibrahim asked suddenly, his voice deceptively casual. Amadou smiled, apparently relieved by the shift to nostalgia. "You convinced her that the cat had knocked it over. She believed you because you had never lied to her before." "That was the first time I understood the true value of trust," Ibrahim continued, his eyes never leaving his childhood friend's face. "Once broken, it can never be fully repaired." Something flickered in Amadou's expression, a moment of uncertainty that confirmed what Ibrahim already knew.
"Ibrahim, is everything all right?"
"You seem troubled." Instead of answering, Ibrahim placed the manila folder on the table between them and opened it slowly. The photographs and documents spilled out like accusatory fingers pointing directly at the man he had considered closer than a brother. Bank records showing payments from shell companies. Transcripts of phone calls where Amadou's voice had been identified discussing security weaknesses. Screenshots of encrypted messages detailing Ibrahim's personal schedule and private meetings. Amadou's face went through a series of transformations: confusion, recognition, and finally, a terrible resignation. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that could never be bridged. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had been carrying a crushing secret for too long.
"How long have you known?"
3 days, Ibrahim replied. "But I've suspected for weeks. Little things, information that was getting out too quickly, security breaches that were too convenient to be accidental." He paused, struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "What I don't understand is why. After everything we've been through together, everything we've built, why would you do this?" Amadou leaned back in his chair, his shoulders sagging as if an enormous burden was finally being acknowledged.
"You want to know why?"
"Because I watched you change, Ibrahim. The revolution was supposed to be about the people, about justice and equality. But somewhere along the way, it became about your vision, your ideology, your uncompromising pursuit of an impossible dream." The words hit Ibrahim like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. What are you talking about? Everything we've done has been for Burkina Faso, for our people. Has it? Amadou's voice grew stronger, as if the confession was liberating him from months of internal conflict. When was the last time you visited a village and actually listened to what the farmers were saying? When did you last sit with the merchants in the markets and hear their concerns? You've surrounded yourself with advisors who tell you what you want to hear, and anyone who questions your decisions is labeled a traitor or a foreign agent. Ibrahim felt a surge of anger, but beneath it was something more dangerous, a flicker of recognition. So you decided to betray everything we worked for? To sell out our country to the same forces we fought against? I tried to talk to you, Amadou shot back, his own anger finally surfacing. Remember 6 months ago when I raised concerns about the mine nationalization timeline? You shut me down, accused me of lacking revolutionary spirit. When I suggested we needed to build more consensus before expelling the French bases, you said I was being weak. Every time I tried to moderate your approach, you treated it as disloyalty. The room fell silent again, both men breathing hard from the emotional exchange. Ibrahim found himself remembering those conversations differently, not as betrayals of principle, but as the concerns of a friend who had been trying to prevent the very situation they now found themselves in. So you went to them, Ibrahim said finally. To the French, to the mining companies, to everyone who wants to keep us in chains.
Amadou shook his head slowly.
I went to people who offered an alternative to the civil war that your policies were going to create. Do you really think you can expel foreign forces, nationalize major industries, and completely restructure the government without triggering a massive conflict? The only question was whether that conflict would destroy everything we've built or whether there might be another way. Another way that involves putting me in a grave? The plan was never to kill you, Amadou said quickly. It was to force a transition, to create a government that could maintain the reforms while building the international relationships necessary for long-term stability. You're not the only one who loves this country, Ibrahim. Ibrahim stared at his oldest friend, trying to reconcile the man he had known with the traitor sitting across from him. Part of him wanted to believe that Amadou's motivations had been pure, that his betrayal had been born from genuine concern rather than personal ambition or foreign corruption. But the evidence was clear. Money had changed hands, secrets had been sold, and people's lives had been put at risk. Did you know about the assassination attempts? Ibrahim asked quietly. Amadou's face went pale. What assassination attempts? 3 separate incidents in the past 2 months. Sniper fire during the Independence Day ceremony. The car bomb that killed my driver. The poisoned food at the diplomatic reception. Ibrahim watched Amadou's expression carefully, looking for signs of deception. You're telling me you knew nothing about any of these? I swear on my children's lives, I knew nothing about assassination attempts, Amadou said, and Ibrahim could hear the genuine horror in his voice. The plan was political pressure, economic sanctions, maybe a show of force to encourage negotiations. Murder was never part of what I agreed to. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, Ibrahim felt a flicker of the old connection between them. Whatever else Amadou had done, he still recognized the man who had once jumped into a swollen river to save a stranger's child, who had shared his last meal with hungry street children, who had wept when they had to use force against protesters who had been manipulated by outside agitators. Who are your contacts? Ibrahim asked. Who's running this operation? Amadou hesitated, and Ibrahim could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Loyalty to his co-conspirators warred with a dawning realization that he had been used by people with far more sinister intentions than he had understood. There's a man named Philippe Dubois, Amadou said finally. He claims to work for a private consulting firm, but I think he's French intelligence. He's the one who first approached me about 6 months ago. He said they were concerned about the direction of the revolution and wanted to explore peaceful alternatives to what they saw as an inevitable confrontation. Ibrahim made a note of the name, already planning to have his intelligence services investigate this Du Bois character. Who else? General Morrison, the mining company representative.
Sarah Chen from the World Bank.
A few local businessmen who were worried about their investments. Amadou paused, seeming to struggle with the next revelation.
And your cousin, Ousmane. The name it Ibrahim like a thunderbolt.
Ousmane Traoré, his father's nephew, the man who had helped raise him after his parents died. The uncle who had taught him to read, who had paid for his education, who had been like a second father throughout his childhood. The betrayal by Amadou had been devastating, but this revelation threatened to shake the very foundation of everything Ibrahim believed about family, loyalty, and trust. Ousmane has been feeding them information about our family, our financial situation, our personal relationships, Amadou continued, his voice growing quieter as he realized the impact of his words. He's the one who told them about your wife's pregnancy before you announced it publicly. He's been documenting your daily routines, your security habits, everything. Ibrahim closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of the conspiracy that had been growing around him like a cancer. The people he had trusted most, his childhood friend, his beloved uncle, had been systematically betraying him to foreign interests that wanted to maintain their control over his country's resources and destiny. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ibrahim asked when he could trust his voice again. "Because when they started talking about assassination, I realized I had made a terrible mistake," Amadou replied. "I thought I was being patriotic, trying to find a compromise that would prevent a larger conflict. But I was being used, and so were you. They never intended to negotiate in good faith. They wanted to eliminate you and install someone they could control completely." Ibrahim opened his eyes and looked at his friend, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in months. Amadou wasn't evil, but he had been naive in a way that had made him dangerous. His good intentions had been weaponized by people who understood exactly how to exploit his genuine concerns and fears.
"What happens now?"
Amadou asked. It was a question Ibrahim had been dreading. As a leader, he knew what had to be done. Treason was treason, regardless of the motivations behind it. The security of the state and the integrity of the revolution demanded justice. But as a friend, as someone who had shared a lifetime of experiences with this man, the thought of what came next was almost unbearable. "You'll be arrested," Ibrahim said quietly. "There will be a trial. The evidence is overwhelming, and the law is clear about the penalties for treason." Amadou nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. "And my family? Your wife and children will be protected. Whatever else you've done, they're innocent in this." Ibrahim paused, struggling with his next words. "I'll make sure they're taken care of, that they have what they need to rebuild their lives." "Thank you," Amadou whispered, and Ibrahim could see tears forming in his eyes. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I was afraid of what was coming, afraid that your uncompromising approach would lead to the kind of bloodshed we saw in other countries." Ibrahim stood up slowly, feeling every one of his 34 years weighing on his shoulders like a mountain. "The tragedy is that you might have been right about some things. Maybe I have become too isolated, too sure of my own righteousness. But the solution wasn't to sell our sovereignty to the highest bidder." The arrest was carried out with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. Ibrahim insisted on personally escorting Amadou to the detention facility, a gesture that surprised many of his security team but felt necessary for his own peace of mind. They rode in silence through the rain-soaked streets of Ouagadougou, past the monuments to independence and the murals celebrating the revolution they had fought for together. At the detention center, as the guards prepared to take Amadou into custody, the two men faced each other one last time. "I hope someday you can forgive me," Amadou said. Ibrahim looked into the eyes of the boy who had once been his closest friend, the young man who had stood beside him through revolution and triumph, the traitor who had nearly brought down everything they had built together. "I already have," he said quietly. "But forgiveness doesn't change the consequences." As the doors closed behind Amadou, Ibrahim felt something break inside him that he wasn't sure could ever be repaired.
Trust, once shattered, leaves scars that never fully heal.
The revolution would continue, the reforms would be implemented, and Burkina Faso would find its path to true independence. But the cost of that victory would include not just the lives lost in battle, but the relationships destroyed by the weight of impossible choices and competing loyalties. The rain continued to fall as Ibrahim walked back to his car, each drop seeming to wash away another piece of his innocence. Tomorrow there would be more arrests to make, more conspirators to uncover, more difficult decisions about the balance between security and justice. His uncle Ousmane would have to be confronted, and that conversation would be even more painful than the one with Amadou. But tonight, as he drove through the empty streets of his capital city, Captain Ibrahim Traoré allowed himself to mourn not just for a friendship lost, but for the simpler world he had once believed in, where loyalty was absolute and the lines between right and wrong were clearly drawn. The revolution had succeeded in changing Burkina Faso, but it had changed him as well, in ways he was only beginning to understand. The boy who had dreamed of justice while kicking a makeshift soccer ball had become a man who understood that sometimes justice demanded sacrificing the very things that made victory meaningful. It was a lesson that would shape every decision he made in the years to come, a reminder that leadership required not just courage and vision, but the willingness to bear the weight of necessary betrayals and the wisdom to distinguish between the compromises that preserved principles and those that destroyed them. As he reached his residence, Ibrahim sat in the car for a long moment, listening to the rain and thinking about the choices that lay ahead. The conspiracy had been larger than he had imagined, reaching into the highest levels of government and the most intimate circles of his personal life. Rooting it out completely would require a level of vigilance and suspicion that went against every instinct he had developed during his years of building revolutionary solidarity. But there was no alternative. The enemies of Burkina Faso's independence had shown they were willing to exploit every relationship, corrupt every friendship, and manipulate every good intention in service of their goals. If he was going to protect what they had built and continue moving toward true sovereignty, he would have to become someone harder, more suspicious, less trusting than the young revolutionary who had begun this journey. The irony wasn't lost on him. In order to preserve the ideals of the revolution, he might have to sacrifice some of the humanity that had inspired those ideals in the first place. It was the kind of tragic contradiction that defined leadership in an imperfect world, where good intentions could be weaponized and noble goals could require ignoble methods. As he finally walked through the rain to his front door, Ibrahim carried with him the weight of knowledge that would reshape everything that came after. The arrests would continue, the trials would proceed, and justice would be served according to the law. But the personal cost of those necessary actions would be paid in sleepless nights, in moments of doubt about decisions that once seemed clear, and in the permanent loss of the kind of trust that had once made the impossible seem achievable. The revolution had begun with the dream of a better world, and that dream was still worth fighting for. But Ibrahim now understood that achieving it would require not just the courage to fight external enemies, but the strength to bear the internal wounds inflicted by the discovery that sometimes the greatest threats come from those closest to home. It was a lesson that would define the rest of his leadership and the future of his country, written in rain and betrayal on a night when everything changed forever. The weeks that followed Amadou's arrest became a blur of interrogations, document analysis, and the careful unraveling of a conspiracy that had tentacles reaching into every corner of Burkina Faso's political and military establishment. Each day brought new revelations that made Ibrahim question not just his judgment about people, but his fundamental understanding of how power operated in the shadows of revolutionary change. The confrontation with his uncle Ousmane proved to be even more devastating than the betrayal by Amadou. When Ibrahim finally sat across from the man who had raised him, armed with bank records showing payments totaling nearly €500,000, he expected anger, denial, or at least some attempt at justification. Instead, Ousmane simply nodded with the weary resignation of a man who had been expecting this moment for months. "You always were too trusting, my boy," Ousmane said, his weathered hands folded calmly on the table between them. "Even as a child, you believed that everyone shared your noble intentions. I tried to teach you that the world was more complicated than your idealistic vision, but you never listened." The casual dismissal of everything Ibrahim had fought for stung more than any accusation of treason could have. "So you decided to sell me out to foreign interests because you thought I was naive?" "I decided to ensure that you would survive your own righteousness," Ousmane replied, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience that had once made Ibrahim feel safe and protected. "Do you really think you could have taken on the French military-industrial complex, the mining cartels, and the international banking system simultaneously without some form of accommodation? Your revolution was doomed from the moment you refused to compromise." Ibrahim stared at this man who had once been his hero, trying to reconcile the uncle who had taught him about dignity and self-respect with the traitor who had been systematically undermining everything he stood for. "The compromises you're talking about would have meant abandoning the very principles that made the revolution necessary in the first place." "Principles don't feed hungry children or build hospitals," Ousmane shot back. "Pragmatism does. The French were willing to increase their development aid by 400% if you had been willing to maintain certain mining concessions. The World Bank had approved infrastructure loans worth billions if you could have demonstrated fiscal responsibility. Instead, you chose ideological purity over practical progress." The argument that followed was unlike anything Ibrahim had experienced since childhood. Ousmane laid out a detailed alternative history of how the revolution could have unfolded, complete with specific agreements that had been negotiated in secret, international partnerships that could have transformed Burkina Faso's economy, and diplomatic arrangements that would have preserved sovereignty while acknowledging geopolitical realities. According to his uncle, the conspiracy hadn't been about destroying the revolution, but about redirecting it toward outcomes that could actually be sustained in the real world of international relations and economic dependencies. The foreign contacts hadn't been enemies seeking to recolonize Burkina Faso, but pragmatic partners willing to work within the new political reality as long as certain red lines weren't crossed. "You could have been the hero who liberated his people and built a prosperous nation," Ousmane concluded. "Instead, you chose to be a martyr who would lead his country into isolation and economic collapse. I was trying to save you from yourself." The conversation left Ibrahim more shaken than he wanted to admit. For all his uncle's betrayal, the alternative path he described wasn't entirely without merit. The international isolation that Burkina Faso was already experiencing was real, the economic pressures were mounting, and the constant threat of military intervention hung over every policy decision like a sword of Damocles. But accepting Ousmane's logic would have meant acknowledging that the revolution itself had been a mistake, that the vision of true independence and self-determination that had inspired millions of people was nothing more than dangerous fantasy. It would have meant admitting that the deaths of those who had fought and died for change had been meaningless sacrifices to an impossible dream. As Ibrahim walked through the streets of Ouagadougou the next morning, observing the daily life of his people, he found himself seeing everything through new eyes. The children walking to school in their crisp uniforms. Would they have better educational opportunities under the compromise arrangements his uncle had described? The farmers loading produce onto trucks bound for the markets. Would they be more prosperous under a system that maintained certain colonial-era trade relationships? The questions tormented him because they didn't have easy answers. Revolutionary leadership, he was learning, wasn't just about having the courage to fight against injustice. It was about making impossible choices between competing versions of what justice might look like, each with its own moral validity and practical consequences. The intelligence reports that crossed his desk each morning painted a picture of a conspiracy that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more fragile than he had initially understood. The foreign actors involved weren't cartoon villains seeking to oppress his people, but calculating pragmatists who understood that accommodation was often more effective than confrontation. They had identified the key pressure points in his government and personal life, then systematically worked to create alternative power centers that could influence policy without direct confrontation. What made the conspiracy particularly insidious was that many of the people involved genuinely believed they were acting in Burkina Faso's best interests. Amadou hadn't been lying when he said his motivations were patriotic. Ousmane really did believe he was protecting his nephew from the consequences of idealistic overreach. Even some of the foreign contacts seemed to have convinced themselves that their preferred outcomes would benefit everyone involved. This realization forced Ibrahim to confront uncomfortable questions about his own leadership style and decision-making processes. Had he really become as isolated and inflexible as his critics suggested? Were there legitimate concerns that he had dismissed too quickly as disloyalty or foreign manipulation? Had his commitment to revolutionary principles blinded him to practical realities that couldn't be ignored indefinitely? The internal security review that followed revealed systematic weaknesses in how information flowed through his government. Too many critical decisions had been made by too small a circle of advisors, creating vulnerabilities that had been expertly exploited by those seeking to influence policy from the outside. The revolutionary government's emphasis on ideological purity had inadvertently created an echo chamber where dissenting voices were marginalized and alternative perspectives were viewed with suspicion. Ibrahim found himself implementing changes that went against every instinct he had developed during the revolutionary struggle. Security protocols were tightened to the point where spontaneous interactions with citizens became virtually impossible. Intelligence gathering was expanded to monitor not just external threats but internal dissent within his own government. The open, consultative leadership style that had been one of the revolution's defining characteristics was replaced by a more centralized, hierarchical system that prioritized control over collaboration. Each of these changes was necessary for protecting the revolution from its enemies, but they also represented a gradual transformation of the movement itself. The question that haunted Ibrahim's sleepless nights was whether a revolution could survive the security measures necessary to protect it, or whether the process of defending revolutionary ideals inevitably corrupted them. The trials of the conspirators began 6 weeks after Amadou's arrest, conducted with all the ceremony and attention to legal procedure that Ibrahim could muster. He was determined that justice would be seen to be done according to proper legal standards, both to legitimize the proceedings in the eyes of his people and to demonstrate that revolutionary justice could coexist with due process and rule of law. Amadou's testimony during his trial provided the most comprehensive account of how the conspiracy had operated, but it also revealed the complexity of motivations that had driven good people to make terrible choices. His friend spoke eloquently about his fears for the future of Burkina Faso, his genuine concerns about the sustainability of Ibrahim's policies, and his belief that compromise might prevent the kind of catastrophic confrontation that had destroyed other revolutionary movements. Listening to Amadou's testimony, Ibrahim was forced to confront the possibility that his oldest friend hadn't been entirely wrong about some things. The international pressure on Burkina Faso was real and growing. The economic costs of complete independence from colonial-era relationships were becoming increasingly apparent. The military threats from neighboring countries influenced by foreign powers couldn't be ignored indefinitely. But acknowledging the validity of some of Amadou's concerns didn't change the fundamental reality that betrayal was betrayal, regardless of the motivations behind it. The rule of law had to be upheld, both to maintain order within the government and to send a clear message to other potential conspirators that treason would not be tolerated regardless of the justifications offered. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one. Amadou was found guilty of treason and sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years for his cooperation with the investigation. Ousmane received a similar sentence, though his advanced age made it unlikely he would live to see freedom again. The foreign contacts were declared persona non grata and expelled from the country, their assets frozen and their business relationships terminated. But even as justice was served according to the law, Ibrahim couldn't shake the feeling that the real consequences of the conspiracy would extend far beyond the courtroom. The trust that had once bound the revolutionary movement together had been shattered in ways that might never be fully repaired. The openness and collaborative spirit that had made the revolution possible would have to be balanced against security considerations that made such openness dangerous. Most painfully, Ibrahim found himself becoming the kind of leader he had once criticized. More isolated, more suspicious, more dependent on security apparatus than on popular support. The revolution had been about bringing power closer to the people, but protecting that revolutionary achievement seemed to require creating distance between the leadership and the very people they claimed to serve. The final report on the conspiracy, when it was completed 3 months later, revealed a network of influence that had penetrated virtually every level of government and society. Foreign intelligence services had cultivated relationships not just with high-level officials but with journalists, academics, business leaders, and civil society activists. The goal hadn't been a crude military coup but a subtle reshaping of public opinion and policy priorities that would have achieved foreign objectives without the instability and international criticism that traditional coups generated. Understanding the sophistication of what they had faced made Ibrahim appreciate how close they had come to losing everything without even realizing it was happening. But it also made him understand how difficult it would be to prevent similar efforts in the future without fundamentally changing the character of the revolutionary government they had worked so hard to build. The lesson that emerged from the crisis wasn't simple or comforting. Protecting revolutionary achievements required vigilance that could easily become paranoia, security measures that could undermine the democratic principles they were meant to protect, and isolation that could cut leaders off from the people they served. The challenge wasn't just defeating external enemies, but finding ways to defend against internal threats without losing the essential character that made the revolution worth defending in the first place. As Ibrahim stood on the balcony of the presidential palace 6 months after Amadou's arrest, looking out over the city they had both fought to liberate, he carried with him the weight of knowledge that leadership in an imperfect world required accepting imperfect solutions to impossible problems. The revolution would continue, the dream of independence and dignity would be pursued, but the innocence that had once made such dreams seem achievable was gone forever, replaced by the hard-won wisdom that freedom's greatest enemies often wore the faces of friends.